Hello, all. Today I'm going to talk about Brick Lane by Monica Ali, which I read towards the end of 2025. This is the story of an immigrant family, but it's really centered on one Bengali woman who migrates to the UK named Nazneen. She moves to London from her birthplace in Bangladesh to get married in, I think, the late 80s, and then finds herself years later raising two preteens in the early 2000s. The latter part being the time frame that makes up most of this book. This is quite a well-known novel about the immigrant experience in London, and it was nominated and shortlisted in 2003 for the Man Booker Prize. If you've read or watched a lot of media about London, but more centered on the experiences of the white community there, this is a look into the lives of another one of the city's many prominent communities, one that I personally found powerful and highly empathetic. Nazanin is a woman who has grown up in Bangladesh, and at the age of 18, she has a marriage arranged with an older man who lives in London, Chanu. He's in his early 40s. So she's never been to London before, and as we understand, has met this man briefly before getting married, but really the two of them don't know each other at all beyond a very basic level familiarity. When she boards a plane with him, going from Bangladesh back to his humble residence in London. He lives in the borough of Tower Hamlets in East London, which was and still is a cultural center of the Bangladeshi migrant community in the city. And this is where most of the novel Brick Lane takes place. And Brick Lane itself is a well-known commercial street in that area. So the novel is about the life that Chanu and Nazanin find themselves living together in London, which, as we find, immediately gets off to a bit of a rough start in multiple ways. But we'll also find that not everything is how it first appears. Now, for me, the characters were the strongest and most memorable part of Brick Lane. For many of the characters we meet in this book, we'll form a first impression of them or a judgment of them that is probably somewhat fair and accurate, but also incomplete in many important ways. And the rest of the book will serve to fill in more missing details for us in a way that adds true color and motivation to even characters that initially may have seemed more basic to us or one note. And it also will present opportunities for the characters themselves to determine how dynamic they are, whether they will make efforts to shape their own identity versus accepting the role that fate or God has given them. They're not always going to make the exact decisions that you would have made, but they are going to make some decisions that surprise you and that can be quite touching. I really appreciate that this book isn't one where you can really tell from the beginning who are going to be the characters that you like the most or that you like the least. And I mean that both in terms of like who I like as a character in the story, as well as just like, do I like them as a person? Do I agree with their decisions and find them a person who would be pleasant to be around? You'll probably find for almost every character in this novel that they do at least a few things that you like and a few things that you don't like. An excellent example of what I mean by this would be the character of Nazanin's husband, Chanu, a man of many contradictions who readers will find at once both fascinating and dull in a way that ultimately makes him quite endearing to many readers, apparently. Myself included. But our first impression of Chanu, particularly if we're outsiders to this community, is that he's fairly traditional, somewhat unimaginative outside of a very narrow scope of ideas, proud of his education, but he's failed to gain any practical skills from it. In some ways, he's almost like a child who needs to be taken care of but doesn't realize this. And Nazneen isn't really even in a mental or social position to take care of him in a proactive way. She basically kind of has to just do what he tells her to do, including the handling of the fallout of some of his poor decisions, which quickly leads her to resent him. And yet, over the course of the book, we see how Nazneen comes to appreciate him in a sense that while she realizes he's not the man she would have chosen, she also accepts that she could have done much worse. Now, I, like probably many of you, am always subconsciously tempted to place characters in buckets of good characters and bad characters, sympathetic and unsympathetic, characters I like and characters I don't like, even though I don't really think this is how literature should be if it's good. But much to the credit of this story, by the middle of the novel, I pretty much had given up on trying to classify the characters, and instead I just decided to see how everything went. I found basically all of them sympathetic in one way or another, frustrating in their own ways, but overall a joy to read. And I think for that alone, this book deserves the recognition that it's gotten. Now, I haven't mentioned it explicitly yet, but this is largely an Islamic community with some characters who are quite devoted to that faith and others who maybe observe some of the associated cultural practices but have different interpretations of what the faith means and what it requires of them. As I mentioned, this book was published in 2003, and it covers the time period including the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States. And while this novel is set in Britain, we see how the various characters in the book react to these events, the tension it creates within the broader community, and really between the broader people of London and the Bengali Muslim community living in Tower Hamlets. And, also how they react to the war that is then conducted by the US against Islamic nations in the Middle East. This book isn't about the geopolitics of it all, but at the same time, it's hard for some of the characters not to ruminate on what's happening in the world around them. And in particular, there's conflict between different members of the local Muslim community about to what extent they should be supporting their brothers and sisters worldwide versus simply focusing on the local politics most near to them, which they probably have the most insight into and power to influence, advocating, for example, for better treatment and against anti-Muslim discrimination in their home city of London. So this volatile global political situation exacerbating tensions that were already present even before the 2001 attacks just adds yet another dimension to the already precarious situation of these immigrants living in Britain, looking to find their footing, to find stability in a culture that's somewhat foreign to them, but also promises new things for them. They've all chosen, in some sense at least, to come here to England. Nazanin's choice was maybe more of her parents' choice and her husband's choice, but there was a choice involved. So on one hand, there is promise here, and on the other hand, there is going home syndrome. A bit of a joke made at the beginning of the novel by a community doctor, also Bengali, who says all of his patients in London are always talking about how they will eventually go back to Bangladesh once they have achieved success after this or that. But this is an incurable disease because they will never go back, and they will also never stop talking about how they are eventually going to go back. This disease is one that certainly afflicts Nazanin's husband, Chanu, who holds a deep love in his heart for his homeland of Bangladesh. Sometimes we even have to wonder what it is that made him come here to London in the first place, and also whether Bangladesh really is all that he remembers it to be. And it's a very apparent dilemma throughout this book for almost everyone living in this Tower Hamlets community. What does it mean to be a Bangladeshi Muslim living in London? What does it mean to be British? Do they feel that they are British to any extent? Do they want to be British? Do they want their children to be British? And of course, the answer is, as it should be, and as I'm sure it is for anyone who has immigrated for a long period to a new country with major cultural differences from their home. It's a complicated question that for many remains unanswered even by the end of the book. But we do see a wide range of responses to what extent people embrace the new culture versus hang on to their old one, and in some cases delicately try to blend the two together in a way that honors them both. I really appreciated this book because actually, as I was reading this book, I was thinking about the ambiguity and the messiness of a lot of the situations within, the feeling that things should go a certain way, but that's not how they're going, or the story takes a turn that isn't what I expected from it or what we wanted from a character, but also still goes in a way that largely makes sense. And the book develops the characters in, I think, a reasonable and interesting way without being predictable. This all kind of just got me thinking, I think that part of what makes a novel really good for me is that it exposes the complexity of the world, the contradictions and the ambiguities of living life and being a person in this world. And it makes them feel real for us in a way that makes us feel, I want to say comfortable, but that's also not specifically not the word I want to use here. That makes us feel less alone in our experiences and our doubts, and it creates a sort of empathy or a sense of a shared experience in the confusion and uncertainty that we find in navigating this world. And in doing so, such a novel makes this ambiguity easier for us to bear, but also without denying that the world is complicated and it is messy, but that ultimately our goal should probably be to honor and acknowledge that complexity instead of resorting to easier, more comfortable, but reductive explanations about the way the world should be. And this is why I specifically didn't want to use the word comfortable, because that seems to also imply to me precisely the thing that I think we actually need to avoid. That got pretty abstract, but if I was to state it more plainly, I'd just say that I think a good novel resists simplifying the world by packaging it into an easy takeaway message. For that reason, you could say that a quality of good literature is that it can't be fully captured in a summary. Like, someone can't really just give you the Spark Notes or the Chat GPT run through. They can tell you some things about it. They can talk about the plot or themes like I'm doing right now. But if you ask your friend what it's about or what's the meaning of it, give me the 5-minute digest, they might be able to tell you something or pique your interest, but you won't really have grasped what the story actually is unless you actually read it and experience it yourself. In fact, if you're a writer or a storyteller trying to find what it is that makes literature great, maybe a good exercise would even be to choose a story that you find great and summarize it, or ask a friend or ask ChatGPT to summarize it. You can even go into some detail and highlight some deeper themes and all that, but once you've gotten this high-level summary of the story, when you take the actual experience of reading the story and then you subtract the summary from it, that's what I see as more of the life essence of the novel. And yeah, it probably varies greatly from one novel to another, since this certain life essence, so to speak, is something that goes beyond common plot points and common themes that you might find across many novels. In reading about this book and its reception afterwards, I did see that there was some backlash against the author for allegedly portraying the Bengali community in an unfavorable way, or in a way that was unflattering to them. I don't really want to give too much weight to this criticism because, I can't speak for everyone out there, but it sounds to me in particular like these protests against the filming of the Brick Lane movie on Brick Lane were led by a pretty small but vocal minority of the community, who frankly, from the articles I read, didn't really seem to have read the book, except for a few excerpts that they highlighted that they didn't like. I don't mean to speak for entire broad groups of people, and certainly there are people out there who read the book and didn't like it, or even were disappointed by its portrayal of them for various reasons. But in my very brief research after reading the book, it just appears that there are as many, if not more, folks out there, including people from or adjacent to the community the book describes, that really appreciated the novel, but who aren't quoted on the Wikipedia page. Nevertheless, some of these articles on this protest seem to have taken hold and propagated. For example, they are highlighted on the fairly short Wikipedia page about the book, so I think it's worth mentioning. And indeed, the most concrete criticism I found in my searching about this protest was that supposedly the book portrays members of the Bangladeshi community as backward, uneducated, and unsophisticated. I suppose I can see where that comes from if you only view things on the surface level, but in reality, this book achieves quite the opposite of such a reductive characterization of this community. To be certain, there are characters in this book that come across as backward, uneducated, and unsophisticated, because trying as much as I can to strip away the negative insinuations in those words, I'm pretty sure there were such characters in the real Brick Lane. My point, though, is that Brick Lane portrays a community that feels real, sometimes embattled, and also textured and complex. Yes, there are people in this novel and in the world who are abusive in the name of religion, who are violent in protests, who lack education, or who look down on others for their lack of education. Yes, not every single person in this community is on the forefront of every single issue that a progressive white Londoner might advocate for. Yes, there are groups of young adults in the community who are afflicted by drug addictions. Even these characters, I would argue, largely come across as understandable and sympathetic, and to simply erase such characters from our telling of the story is, in my view, doing them a disservice, because it allows other people with a more negative agenda in mind to tell their own stories about such people. And in addition to these characters who are more difficult, you could say, we see a whole bunch of characters who, although still grappling with their immigrant identities, are very admirable. One well-respected doctor in the community comes across as one of the kindest men in the book. Community organizers face internal controversies, but most of them are peaceful and quite self-aware in resisting actions or protests that they know would give those watching them a reason to cast the community in a negative light. Not all of them are like this, but most of them in the organization that we see up close are more cautious and concerned about how their community is viewed. Chanu, though lacking the social recognition and prestige in the broader London community that he hoped his education would bring him, is actually, at least by the end of the novel, very well educated in an academic sort of way, and frankly, comically insightful about what's going on and what will happen. For example, in his projections after the US is attacked on 9/11, even as the novel juxtaposes this with his complete ineffectiveness in just about any other sphere of his life. And Nazanin and the other women of the book, though making some questionable choices at times, come across as a resourceful and adaptive bunch who, sure, are not like determined to crush the patriarchy, but often are making real decisions to improve their status and the status of the men in their community alongside themselves in a way that is practically feasible. So people may feel uncomfortable about how some of the characters are portrayed in this book, and they have that right. For example, one reviewer I watched who was largely complimentary about the novel still wished she had seen more Muslim wives in the novel who came across as more independent without controlling husbands. And yet, the overall picture drawn in this novel still feels real to me. Like I said, the honesty about some of the rougher edges of the community, the author's commitment and sincerity in portraying the community as she sees it, instead of how people might like to think it is for me one of the great strengths of the book, because it allows this book to resist what would be legitimate accusations we might make of other modern novels, that in their eagerness to paint a minority community in a positive light, they essentially just romanticize the community and entirely fictionalize it, neglecting the real challenges and contradictions the community faces. At the end of the day, these challenges the Brick Lane community faces lead a reader like me to admire and empathize with the community, all the community, not to view them as backward, uneducated, and unsophisticated. Brick Lane is truly a book about trying to toe the line between two cultures. And in fact, one review I watched on YouTube pointed out that Brick Lane itself can be seen as a metaphor for the separation between the Bangladeshi community and the broader London community. This struggle is most visible through Chanu and Nazneen. Let's start with Chanu. He's a man who's sort of trying to bridge the gap between the two cultures, and yet he never goes beyond sort of wading into the culture of London because he holds such a fondness for Bangladesh and almost feels as if any embrace of the London culture is a betrayal of his heritage. And despite his initial coldness towards Nazneen, many readers, including myself, find him to be a very endearing character for all his contradictions. He really takes such pride in being a moderate and an open-minded man, which he sees as in line with being well-educated. He says to his wife over and over again, "You're lucky that I'm an educated man because I let you go out of the house, I let the girls do this, and I even let you associate with the non-respectable type." And it's always funny because we, of course, as modern readers, we see what he's doing and we see the limits to what he's doing. Yes, he does let his wife leave the home, but he also does expect her to be a housewife to the point where, even when the family is completely running out of money, it is very difficult for him to say to Nazneen, okay, I see that you can do sewing or tailoring or whatever the exact nature of the work that she takes up is. This is what we need for you to do right now. It's hard for him to do that. And you see throughout the novel just how torn he is between the customs of his old world and his new one. Nazneen I found a little trickier to pin down. Personally, I kind of struggled to really get deeply into her mind because we see right into her mind, but precisely because she is a character whose growth in this book requires her going through a long period of being very passive and just leaving everything to fate. When she reaches the point at which she does transform, it feels to me a little bit more abrupt. It's tough to really see what it is that made her suddenly change here. Of course, you could say that if Chanu is a character who never manages to go beyond tiptoeing into the shallow end of the pool, Nazneen is one who sits on the side watching for the longest time before eventually and impulsively just diving into the deep end only to realize she can't swim and it almost ends up killing her. But at the end, she survives it and learns to swim in this pool of the culture of London in her own perhaps awkward but still effective way, which is more than many other characters ever achieve. This is how it feels to me looking back on the whole story. But it isn't exactly how I felt while I was reading the book. Much of Nazneen's character growth felt abrupt and random, and in a way it still kind of does. I don't always get why Nazneen acts in the way that she does throughout the book, why she transforms in the way that she does, or how this is a direct result of her experiences, but that doesn't really mean she's a poorly drawn character, I think. I just couldn't quite get into her mind and relate to her quite as much as some of the other, even more minor characters. Of course, Nazneen struggles from the start of the book with trying to understand whether to leave her life to fate or God, or to take things into her own hands. And I think we would argue that she eventually does take things into her own hands and learns that she herself must play an active role in governing her life and her fate, so to speak, even as there are limits to how much control she has over it. And this all sounds kind of vague and cliche, so I'll stop there. But yes, much of the book may be interesting to interpret through this lens of contrasting fate and choice. I guess maybe I'll just say my interpretation of how it ends up is that in starting a relationship with Karim, she thinks that this is her taking her fate into her own hands, but the way that it's presented in the book, it's actually only in ending this relationship and coming clean in various different ways to others who are close to her. It's only then that she really takes control over her own life. Because during the time she's seeing Karim, it seems like she's more trapped than ever on autopilot during that period, even if she's gone outside the bounds of her normal life as she sees it. There are lots more other characters I could talk about, but I won't for the sake of time. I do want to bring up one more, though. Razia is personally, I think, a really interesting character because she can come across as abrasive and somewhat crass at first. We hear repeatedly from Chanu how she is not the respectable type, and on a surface level, this is true. She doesn't follow all the implicit rules of the community. She's willing to speak her mind, and yet at her core, by the end of the book, she turns out to be one of the most, I would say possibly the most admirable character in the book. I mean, I guess maybe some of your interpretation of her also depends on your views about the value of assimilating more to the local culture versus sticking to your roots. But Razia is the one who most comfortably occupies this new world that she lives in, to the point that she's literally wearing the UK flag on her clothes in half of the scenes in the novel. I wouldn't say she's casting aside her old identity entirely, but she almost kind of does, in the sense that I'm not saying she forgets where she's from, but she does dispense with this idea that she's going to go back to Bangladesh entirely. She views herself as now grounded in London. She takes the good and the bad of the new world that she lives in and approaches it all in a pragmatic way that maybe makes things much easier for her in terms of reducing internal conflict than things are for Nazneen and Chanu. Also, though, the real reason why I admire her the most here is that she turns out, at the end of the day, to be very loyal. She's the only person who Nazneen can really speak to and open up to about her challenges and the sort of taboos that she's unable to discuss with everyone else. In that way, Razia ends up being a sort of a catalyst for Nazneen's character development and for her discovery of her own agency, I think. And I took even more notes on the book than this, but I feel this review is coming to a natural closing point here, even if there's so much more that could be said of it. All in all, I certainly did enjoy the book. I wouldn't recommend it for everyone, and the reason for that is because people who are looking for more of a plot-driven or even a novel with stronger character arcs, even if not entirely plot-driven, I wouldn't really say that this is the novel for them. Personally, I like that, and I think it's quite beautiful how it portrays both this family and this broader community of Brick Lane within East London. But I think if you go into this book looking for something with more of a traditional narrative story structure to it, then you'll be disappointed and left feeling unsatisfied if you even make it to the end. But yeah, that's Brick Lane, and I would recommend it for people who are interested in reading about London and learning about a subculture that is maybe a bit lesser known for those of us who have only read the most widely famous stuff that's set in London, but a culture that is, still very much an alive culture today and an important piece of the fabric of London, even if it has changed since the book was initially published. So yeah, tell me what you thought of this story if you read it, or even let me know what your own favorite London novel is. And as always, thanks for watching and happy reading.